Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I know we just hit the top of the hour, so we're starting right on time. I know people will generally tend to trickle in a little bit after the start time, but wanted to keep this to schedule because I know we got a lot of good stuff to cover today. So everyone, thank you for joining. Really excited about this seminar. It's our first one in 2024. We've done these in the past where we typically want to highlight different data partners that we have on the Dewey platform or highlight some of the research being done by the researchers of our platform. I'm particularly excited about today's topic, given that I'm a huge fan myself of People Data Labs. I've used them in the past commercially, so I'm very familiar firsthand with their data. I just also love working with this team. It's been great to kind of partner up with these guys and kind of seeing what they're doing. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in a bit, and we'll get into their data set specifically. But before I dive into that, I just want to do a couple housekeeping items. So one, this is recorded. So we're going to share this with anyone who's going to be wanting to look back on it or share it with others. And so you'll get an email from me in the next day or two with a link to that recording. And so be on the lookout for that. That email, feel free to reply to, and it'll go directly to me if there's any questions that maybe aren't answered during the seminar. But I want to say that this is supposed to be interactive, so please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get those questions answered, hopefully live as they come through. We'll definitely save some time at the end, but I'll kind of be monitoring the Q&A, and I'll interject our speakers and try to ask questions kind of on a timely manner. So definitely feel free to ask questions. I think that's going to make this exceptionally much better if we actually have some participation. So feel free to use that. And then finally, in that follow-up email, you're going to see some links to future seminars we have. I think the ones on the agenda we have are from PassBy, which is one of the foot traffic data providers we have on the platform, and lobbyingdata.com, which is obviously a lobbying data partner as well. So be on the lookout for those. You'll get links to those in the follow-up email as well. And with that, I want to introduce our panelists today. So first, I'll introduce Ben Eisenberg. He's the VP of Innovation from People Data Labs. Like I said, I've used People Data Labs myself. I love this company. I love working with these guys, and their data is really exceptional. And I'm particularly excited about seeing Ben dive into kind of the history of the product and how it's evolved, and also how this data is sourced. I know in academic research, it's really important to understand kind of the quality and the sourcing of the data sets that we're working with. And so Ben's joining us to go pretty deep into that. And then finally, I'll turn it over to David. So David is a researcher from University of Michigan. He's actually been a former presenter in these seminars in the past, and I'd encourage you to go check out that seminar as well. He had a really cool research actually studying mobile device data in Ukraine during the start of the war and seeing how reactions changed over time to alerts that were sent out by the government. It's a pretty fascinating piece of research and definitely worth the listen if you have some time. And so with that, basically, I'll start it out with Ben. He's going to go into the background, and then we'll go to David at the end to kind of go into some examples of how this data can be used in the academic world. And with that, Ben, take it away.
Thanks, Evan. So yeah, excited to share a little bit about People Data Labs. Thanks for having me on this webinar. So I always like to start off these with just a little bit of baseline knowledge in terms of our overview and vision. So we actually started off as a recruiting platform. So our founders had decided that they wanted to enter into the wild world of technology. They had seen a need that recruiters were interested in understanding the quality of software development and engineering candidates. And so they built a platform where recruiters could search, run Boolean searches against a pool of candidates, and People Data Labs, at the time called Talent IQ, would rank and score those and provide those out. They'd done a great job building that business. We built it, to about 6 figures in revenue. And then one of our competitors actually approached us and said, "Hey, we love your data set. We would love to actually purchase your data." And it was at that moment that we realized, there's a lot of value, of course, in building a platform, but potentially as we move into, the late 2010s, early 2020s, there's even more value in building the data. So we decided to pivot. We raised a funding round from a data-driven VC, and we rebranded to People Data Labs, which is where we are today. And our vision from 2017, when we rebranded onward, hasn't really changed, which is that our goal is to really build really high-quality B2B data, linking data on people and companies together, taking in data from thousands of different sources, and building one source of truth essentially on the labor market, on companies in the market, and we provide that data out to a variety of end users. Our customer base is really, really diverse, which is something that we're always very excited about. So we serve 4 core verticals. And within those verticals, we serve external providers who are commercializing our data. And we also serve internal teams who are using the data, for their own internal purposes. So in HR, people will use our data as a source of candidate data. They'll use our data to analyze the labor market. I'd say a lot of the use cases in HR are probably very similar to some of the things that David will present later around understanding the labor market, understanding the workforce, understanding, sort of what's going on in the B2B space. You could also, parallelize a lot of what people are doing in HR with what people are doing in sales and marketing, where they're looking at individuals' resumes, right? Looking at their contact information, trying to advertise to them, sell to them, etc. The other really unique use case that we have is in investment research, where people are using our data to understand individual companies and try to predict how those companies are going to perform, whether that's in the public markets, trying to predict their revenue and earnings, or if it's earlier stage in the private markets, trying to understand the trajectory of the company and make a decision as to whether or not they want to invest. And then finally, we power platforms in fraud and risk that are tapping into our wide identity graph to really just understand more about people, elevate their ability to provide people and companies credit, and just tap into sort of the broad set of data that we have. The key thing, like Evan said, that I always also like to hit on as I'm just giving like a little bit of an overview of the company is where this thousands of data sources are coming from. So what we do is we combine two main sources of data. The first is our data union, which is unique and novel and what makes our data so powerful. The data union is a data sharing co-op of a lot of the customers that I mentioned on the previous slide. So customers provide us with warrants that they have, acquired the data compliantly, that they have the right to pass on the data to a reseller and an aggregator, and that data can be used for a series of use cases that we outline in our acceptable data use policy. This allows us to serve, some of the companies in the Fortune 1000 all the way down to startups and have them be confident that the data that we're sourcing is acquired in a compliant way. And when it comes to B2B contact information, right, that's increasingly important just with the landscape of regulation that's going on. The second source for data is public data. So we crawl the open web. We use that data to just enhance our data set. One of the things that we really pride ourselves on is our ability to standardize and match the data to each other. So when you're getting in data from thousands of different sources, you have to resolve that data down into a singular data set. Otherwise, it's just sort of a mess. And we use public data to help support that. So things like title standardization, location standardization, company standardization, as well as additional information on people are examples of things that we might get from the public web and use to enhance the process of taking in this data union data and consolidating it down into a single source of truth. Quick overview of how we build our data. I sort of hit on this a little bit. But we start off with all these different sources. We evaluate those sources for quality and accuracy. We then, clean the data. So we actually standardize it as well. So we actually take that data and map it to a finite set of values. What that allows users to do is it makes it very easy to run queries and searches against the data. It makes it easy to run aggregations against the data. And when we have such a broad data set of resumes, it's really important that when one person says they work at Google and the other person says they work at Alphabet, that those two things map to the same entity within the People Data Labs data, and it's easy to resolve, combine, and use them. We then merge and deduplicate the data together using both probabilistic and deterministic methods. And then we do QA, validate the data, ensure that it's accurate, and provide that data out both to our data union partners and to our other customers. And we track all of this, on a source-by-source basis. So we have lineage of where data came from, whether or not it's still usable given the changing global privacy and compliance landscape. And if we find quality issues in individual sources as we move further down the pipeline, we have the ability to go back and remove those sources or make changes to how we're ingesting them. So talked a lot about our data, but didn't really say fully what our data is. So the first thing that we have is a data set of people. We have an identity graph of over 3 billion unique identities that we believe represent about 1 billion unique people globally. Within that data set, the research use cases, HR use cases that a lot of customers and institutions focus on really dive into our 800 million resumes that we have globally. We provide updates to that 800 million set of resumes monthly. So we continue to ship off, job change data, information on people's education, skills, et cetera, on a monthly basis for people to use. And this is just a little bit more of a deep dive into sort of the fields that we offer. Some of these fields are obviously less relevant for most research use cases, like demographics, emails, phone numbers, social profiles. But the core resume information of locations, titles that are standardized, companies that are standardized, schools that are standardized, degrees that are standardized, I think is what might really resonate with the people on this webinar. We then take that data, and one of the things that I've mentioned a couple of times is we have this standardized data set of companies. So we actually also provide out our data set of 60 million companies. That company data set has core firmographic information for identifying the company, like its name, its website, its industry, how much funding it's raised, and we ship that out on a monthly basis. And then the thing that's really exciting, that's actually freely available if you're a subscriber to Dewey, is our company insights data, which provides aggregated person resume data at the company level. So if you're looking to understand, for example, the change in engineering and sales headcount at a certain company or within a group of companies, we already have pre-done and pre-built those aggregations for our customers. And that data is available in Dewey. We break down headcount by role, we break down headcount by location. We look at, what companies are people coming from, what companies are people going to, and in investment use cases, in talent analytics use cases, for research use cases, people will often leverage this aggregated data as a way to quickly get signal, as a way to quickly understand trends. And then they might potentially go back to the person data, either anonymized or de-anonymized, to actually go and deep dive into the individual resumes. With that, I just, always like to close out just highlighting that, we have a very, very diverse set of users using this data across a lot of use cases. Typically in Q&A sessions, I get a lot of questions about sort of the art of the possible and what things are achievable with the data, what the limitations of the data are. So I always like to highlight and just spend a little bit of time sitting on this slide, highlighting that there's so many broad use cases because this is a really broad just data set on the workforce. And I think people can get really, really lost in that sometimes, but also really, really energized by the fact that, there's tons and tons of different use cases for our data. And with that, I'll hand it over to David, and David's going to go through some practical applications of the People Data Labs data set.
That's good. And Ben, I'll maybe pause quickly here just because I want to give people time to type in any questions. And again, feel free to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions for Ben or David as we go in this. I think, David, as you get set up, Ben, maybe I have one question for you I'm curious about personally is like when you think about People Data Labs' evolution and their data products, and you talked a lot about kind of the founding story and the history of where you got to today. What does tomorrow look like? Like, how do you think about continuing to improve your products and evolve and differentiate your offerings?
I think the thing that a lot of our customers really value about us is our ability to standardize and clean data sets, join them together, and then deliver them in a way that's consumable and easy to use. So I think when we think about the future of People Data Labs, it's really modular. It's about how can we add more data sets, more fields, more signals to that existing data. We get questions all the time about increasing our coverage of people. One of the areas that we're not as strong is the blue collar workforce, for example. So we get questions about how do we add more rows to the person data set. We get asks all the time for job posting data, for example, or for linking SEC filing data or small business filing data to our company data set. And I think a lot of our roadmap, is very, very tied to just continuing to double down on improving the data, joining in more data sets, and just expanding sort of the potential use cases and accessibility to the data. Because, if we can consistently do that across a lot of different markets and industries and use cases, I think sort of the possibilities are endless, just given, the trends in the larger market of, people tapping into data more and more.
Nice. We did have one question come through. So can you talk through how the data works in terms of like the time series? And I know this is a little different from the resume people data to how you think about the historical data when it comes to the company insights. I've seen the data, so I'm familiar with kind of how you structure those, but how do you think about like the time series or the refresh cadence of the various products that you offer?
Yeah, so we regenerate and rebuild those time series on a monthly basis. Currently, we provide those time series at the company level for both US and global companies, and everything within the company record is sort of tapping into whatever their global workforce that's associated with the company is. One of the limitations, of course, of rolling things up to an aggregated insight is that we can't do everything, in a series of aggregations. So we often get companies asking us, hey, can you do this just for the US? Or hey, can you do this just for software engineers? And so one of the recent offerings that we've actually built out is providing custom aggregations to customers. But similarly, again, if you had access to the person data, you could build whatever sort of aggregations that you wanted.
Nice. Yeah, and I've seen on the company data, it's really cool to see the growth of these companies over time. I think there was like a head count per month and per year as the companies evolved over time, and the historical coverage is pretty good. Obviously, it depends on how long the company's been around. I think the follow-up question is how far does that data go back? I've seen some examples of 10 plus years, but then you probably have a more concrete number for me.
Yeah, so we generate the insights data starting in 2010, which is where we feel like our resume data is very complete. We do have resumes that go back, into the 20th century, mid 20th century. If an individual has a job that they started in 1973 on their resume, we have it. But what we've found is, before 2010, the aggregations have a lot less signal just because, people have dropped out of the labor force. They, existed
Yep.
before People Data Labs existed. So we don't cover them as much.
Perfect. Nice. Well, David, we can jump to you now. And again, anyone can continue to ask questions and I'll chime in and we can circle back to Ben at the end too if other questions come in. But David, how about we go into some of the use cases that you saw?
All right. Yeah, and thanks, Ben, for the interesting presentation. That was illuminating. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick discussion of how I experience People Data Labs. This is really from the academic perspective. I think that's appropriate because Dewey sort of targets the academic audience. And yeah, I mean, Ben has given like a bunch of use cases. I can also see a trillion use cases from a non-academic perspective, but this is just how I see it as an academic. So the first, I'll start off by discussing how the data isn't new to academics. And I'll start by discussing the company data first, which comes with a subscription. And I guess as they say on YouTube, this is not an unbiased review, right? This is really just my perspective. So the basic company data is in some way very standard. You get name, you get the size of the company, employee counts, industry, stuff like that. And you could find that in any number of commonly available and commonly used data sets in the academic literature. So Orbis, Bureau Van Dijcke, or CompuStat. Most universities have subscriptions to those. Already, though, even just on this front, there is a difference with these data sets in the sense that the People Data Labs seems to have a lot of companies. So CompuStat is only public firms. I think even compared to Orbis, it is very broad coverage, and so as Ben mentioned, it includes startups and private companies and stuff like that. And that's already quite neat because that's in itself not easy to get. And then there's quite rich text descriptions I noticed. So there's like a description of the company and then some tags and stuff like that. That's also very cool for like if you want to do natural language processing or stuff like that. But so this is really the aspect that's not very unique, and already there are some things that are pretty cool. Now what is very new and which I think is very exciting about this data is you get basically on the broad term you get employee churn data, right? So you get information on employee tenure, how long have employees been at the company. You get monthly addition, so employee additions, departures, and counts. That's really, I have been on projects where we wanted to get that kind of data, and it was just sort of, we'll never get it. Definitely not at that frequency, definitely not at the company level. And it's also broken down by role and level. So you'll see additions or churn by employee roles and the levels of their job, so senior management or trainee or whatever. So basically the only source where you could get this kind of data, or where I've seen it in academic research, is in what you call matched employer-employee data sets, or in sort of more aggregated official statistics. So I would say the company data is somewhere in between those two. So matched employer-employee data sets are really, I think that's basically the people data, so the non-aggregated data, but the company data from People Data Labs is somewhere in between those two. So match employer-employee data is like you can track employees at different companies over time, or sometimes only in the cross-section. And so here you can kind of do that, but not at the employee level. You can do it at the company level. Still, that's much better than what you can get from public data like aggregate official statistics. And so this matched employee data is generally really hard to get. it's usually from government. It's very confidential. You have to have some secure access. So I've heard stories of people having to travel to Austria to access that kind of data in a limited time window. Versus people data labs, it's just available. You could do it on your local computer. You could do it on AWS. You could link it with numerous external data sources, which would never be allowed from by governments, right? Any dimension you can think of, and I'll get to some of those, you could link it with additional data. So that's like super cool, I think. So you also get these job-to-job flows, as Ben mentioned. So in the company data, that means you get the top previous and next employers, and then also executive flows, so recent executive hires and stuff like that. That's also pretty unique, especially the executive hires. And I think a lot of interest to various literatures in economics specifically. So, generally in labor economics, I think this data will be very popular and widely used if people get their hands on it. There's a huge literature on job creation and destruction, employee churn, job flows. These are really almost separate branches of labor economics. So look at the work of Haltiwanger and Pissarides. And the things you could do with these kind of data really opens up new questions in that literature. So as I sort of mentioned, with this data, you can speak directly to employment and not just applications. So there is quite some literature on job applications using job vacancy data. I think Indeed.com. I've worked on that as well. And one big question we always faced there was, if you use job application data, you're not really talking about employment. And there's a mismatch between applications and employment. With this data, you can speak directly to employment, and especially the monthly additions and departures and these employee counts. That's really a unique feature. Then yeah, Ben touched on this as well. It comes directly matched to company data. So that's like a dream for an academic researcher. I've spent like a whole summer trying to match Indeed.com data to standard company data in people data labs. It just comes like that. And from working with it, a typical problem is firm names. They'll be like horribly coded in Indeed.com, for example. Any variation of Google that you can think of, Google mistyped and with additions and the local Google office and everything like that. You'll have to use like fuzzy matching methods and everything. It takes a long time. It's computationally expensive. In this data set, you just get it like that. So that's great. And from working with it, I had no issues with the company names. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, there's like 1,000 possible crossovers. So not just labor economics, but you could look at finance, because you have the finance and labor, because you have the ticker information. The corporate finance literature is an obvious area that would be interested in this industrial organization as well, where you could look at, for example, job stealing across firms, because you have those job-to-job flows. And then macroeconomics, because of the super broad coverage of the data. So as Ben mentioned, there's like several million resumes, so you could really look at aggregate flows as well. Okay, then briefly on the I don't have a time here. Oh, here we go. Briefly on the people data. So basically the people data, as Ben mentioned, is like the company data broken down at the employee level. So you get the entire job and education history of employees. In addition, you get this rich contextual data, social media handles, etc., job titles, roles, and levels. And then again, there's 1,000 ways to combine this with external data, which is super unique. I've never worked with data like that. So you have all the social media handles. One immediate thing that comes to mind is you could scrape software engineers' GitHub profiles and look at how many commits they do every month, something like that, to capture their productivity. There's 1,000 ideas you could come up with like this. And then the super cool thing is you can follow employees across companies. So this is the aspect that makes it basically match employer-employee data, except you don't have to travel to Germany to get it. So you could construct job-to-job networks between firms. And then any of the topics I discussed for the company data, you could study those at the individual level. So I'll just give one example of something we've been working on. It's pretty preliminary, but I think it gives a sense of what you can do with this data. So we looked at the return to office implementation of a large tech company in the People Data Labs data to estimate the effect of the implementation of that policy on employee tenure. So basically, we're asking, do people leave the company earlier because of the return to office policy? And this was at a time when, you know, other tech companies had not. This is one of the first movers in the return to office implementation, so people could, you know, conceivably move to other tech firms that still had a work from home policy. And, you know, at the time, there's news articles about employees of that large tech firm saying, "Oh, we're gonna leave the company if this goes through." So this provides some evidence on that. So the basic method we use is we construct synthetic controls. So what's the idea behind synthetic controls? You look at Apple. You look at Apple. That's the tech company we're looking at, and you say you look at it before and after the return to office policy. The problem is there might be other uncorrelated reasons why people are leaving Apple after the return to office policy that have nothing to do with maybe Apple implemented this return to office policy because stuff was already going bad or because employees were already leaving. Then we wouldn't really be capturing the causal effect of that policy. So what the synthetic controls method does is we use other very similar tech companies, so basically direct competitors of Apple, to reconstruct the behavior of Apple's employee tenure distribution before its return to office policy. And then that's our kind of factual. So we're saying that's how the Apple's employee distribution would have evolved if it hadn't gone back to the office. And so this is a method developed by my supervisor, Florian Gonzalez. So the question that we're answering is, what would Apple's employee tenure distribution have looked like if it hadn't gone back to the office? So what we find is that on average, employees stay around at Apple around 100 days less than if it hadn't implemented the return to office policy. So people are leaving, and they're leaving about 100 days earlier than they would have otherwise done. This effect kicks in around 4 to 5 months after the implementation of the RTO, which is, I think that's quite nice that we find that, because that's around the average job search period in the US. So that's around how long it takes people to find a new job. We don't really find an effect for the bottom 10 quantiles, so new employees, which I think makes sense, right? So new hires might be, you know, they're happy to get the job. They're not instantly going to leave because there's a policy that they don't like, a new work from home policy. And then it sort of linearly increases until the median tenured person, after which it stays flat. So I'll show you the profile here. So the first 3 months here, June, July, and August, are our placebo months. So those are the months where we're trying to reconstruct. So what we're looking at here is on the x-axis is the quantiles, and the y-axis is the change in tenure. So the quantiles means the quantiles of the tenure distribution. So if we're looking at higher quantiles, that's people who have been tenured for longer. Then the y-axis is change in tenure in days. So, you know, positive would mean people stay 100 days longer on average. Negative 100 means they leave 100 days earlier. And so June, July, and August is our placebo, where we're trying to reconstruct the Apple's employee tenure distribution as closely as possible. And so you can see that our confidence intervals basically almost always include 0, which means the two distributions are synthetic distribution, and the true Apple employee distribution at that time are not significantly different. So we can reconstruct them quite well. Now what you see from September onwards, so at first September, October, November, we don't really see effects, although at the bottom of the, you know, the 10 to 25th quantile, we see that the effect starts becoming negative, so people start leaving earlier. And then really about around January, February, March, the entire distribution shifts down, which means across the tenure distribution, so from, you know, people who were relatively new at the company to people who have been there for many years, people start leaving earlier by around 100 days. Maybe it levels out around 150 days. And so here you can see the sort of linear decrease that I was talking about. So in the bottom quantiles, there's not really an effect. Then as we move up the quantiles, we see gradual decrease in the number of days people are staying. So basically, more experienced employees are leaving at a higher rate. Yeah, and so this is an example of just one example of what you can do with this data. And as I said, there's a million things you can do. And I see there's a bunch of questions. So
Awesome. Thanks, David. That was awesome. I really appreciate you diving into that. And it was good to kind of see a hands-on example and how you're starting to think about it for research as well. So yeah, definitely a bunch of questions. Keep them coming. We'll try to power through these. And if we don't get to any, we'll be sure to follow up. So please continue to put your questions in. But just to kind of run through these and, we might pull up a screen or two from Ben's presentation just to recover some of this stuff. But one question that came through is kind of, I'm curious about the differences in the use cases between People Data Labs and someone like Revelio Labs. I'll pause there. It's a two-part question, but that's part one. So maybe Ben, if you want to touch on any differences, and maybe Revelio is just a specific example. I saw a previous question about L2 or just general differentiation would be interesting.
Definitely. I'll hit L2 quickly and then go deeper into Revelio. So L2 is a voter database aggregator. So they're aggregating, information on voters and linking it to consumer information. It's sort of a different type of data than we have. Their primary focus is for understanding, the market of people in the United States, their political affiliation, their interests, etc. for, as far as I know, mostly voter specific use cases. With us, our data is obviously joinable to the L2 data since they have, contact information for voters and we have contact information for people generally. But we're a lot more focused on the resume and sort of the labor market. So like, if you were looking to do research similar to what David described around, the labor market, PDL would be a good fit. If you're looking to do research more on sort of the voter side of things, right? L2 would be a much better fit. In terms of Revelio, I would say that's probably like the most direct comparable company to People Data Labs, especially for these research use cases. So our typical like macro differentiator is that we provide contact information, which resonates a lot more, of course, with providers who are commercializing the data, who are reselling the individual profiles, etc. For a research use case, I'd say the data offerings are very, very similar. So if you're familiar with Revelio, you sort of probably understand the use cases for People Data Labs pretty well. The differences that we have in terms of like a research applicable difference are, our coverage and freshness. We would say that we're better. I'm sure they would say that they're better. So we would typically encourage people to do like a little bit of a bake-off evaluation. We also feel very comfortable with our data sourcing and compliance positioning. So that's something that often differentiates us when we're talking to enterprises or we're talking to organizations that, require some level of scrutiny when dealing with individual data. And then I'd say the third difference, although I wouldn't say it's a differentiator in either direction, is our title taxonomies are different. And we're both very transparent about our title taxonomies. You can go look at Revelio's taxonomy on their documentation. You can go look at our taxonomy on our documentation. And there are differences between the taxonomies. I will, of course, as a People Data Labs employee, say our taxonomy is better, but I think there's different use cases for both taxonomies and approaches. We take more of a deterministic approach to building our taxonomy, whereas they take more of like a language-based clustering approach. And those both have positives and negatives. I did see a question later in the chat that I'm just going to jump to because I'm thinking about titles, which was around matching job titles and roles to SOC occupation codes. So we do have the ONET taxonomy tagged to the current job for every person in our data. We don't tag historic jobs, which is a slight limitation. And then the other big challenge with the ONET and all the sort of federal census data is the categories are both very specific and very general in different industry verticals. So a lot of our customers struggle to leverage those codes and that taxonomy when actually trying to do any sort of aggregate research or productize the data. We do have some subset of customers who join the data to the SOC codes and do sort of comparisons to see where is the data stronger, where is the data less strong, and then use either the SOC occupations or the PDL role and sub-role tags to actually do the research because it's a little bit faster moving, and the fill rates on the role and sub-roles are a little bit higher because we try to be as accurate as possible when tagging people to SOC occupation codes. Sorry, I stumbled over my words there. But
that's good. I've been stumbling too. So I guess one kind of follow-up question, it's probably related to Revelio, given that I know a little bit about their data set too, are skills of the employees covered in the data set? And I know the answer is yes, but maybe you can cover that as well a little bit more on that for you guys.
Yes. going back to my favorite topic of occupation codes, our skills are reported at the employee level. So whatever an employee tells us on their resume is the information that we have in our skills field in our person data. What that means is we don't have 100% fill rates for skills. What that also means is when you compare to the SOC occupation codes, the SOC occupation codes have a list of skills tied to each occupation code that are sort of just generic for that occupation. We would obviously see differences between our data and that data, which is something that a lot of people use for Signal. So if a SOC occupation code for data scientists says these are the relevant skills, but PDL data has a different distribution or frequency distribution of those skills that are listed, that's often an interesting area to dig into.
And then this might be for either of you, and you maybe have talked about it with kind of the SOC joining, but like how do you think about joining the company database to other data sets, like you might get from PitchBook or Crunchbase or anyone else? Like what's the kind of best process for joining on the company level?
We have a couple of different join keys that I'd say are pretty useful, especially with the specific data sets that you name. So we try to have as many core firmographic identifiers as possible linked to a company, so that work is already done. That includes Crunchbase URLs and IDs. It also includes tickers, which is a common key that people use to join to PitchBook or other financial data. There are some, obviously keys that we don't have, or data sets that you might want to join to, which are outside of the realm of what's easily joinable to the People Data Labs data. And I don't know, David, if you want to take that, or if you want me to take how you would approach that.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't really done matching. I have worked with the firm names because I was getting a set of tech companies that resemble Apple. And I mean, maybe I can loop it back to you. Then it seemed to me that the firm names were very standardized. Almost basically it was maybe it's just at least that you have a raw company name field and a clean company name field, and the cleaned one seemed basically like the official company name. And if it's that, then as long as you have the official company name, you're good. And I also noticed the ticker. Yeah, basically what you said, there seemed to be a bunch of ways to do it, and the field seemed very clean. So I don't think it would be very difficult.
And the generic approach that we've seen people take is ideally they have like a unique identifier that is joinable, like a website domain, for example, that's pretty generic across all data sets as a table stakes sort of join key. Obviously, there are some data sets that don't have website, like legal company filings typically don't have a website. And then people will use the names. We have our own enrichment and matching functionality that we expose via an API that a lot of our commercial customers will use. Or people will build their own sort of probabilistic name matching. If you get to that level, right, which is you don't have any other deterministic join key that you could use.
Yeah, maybe just a detail there. I used some fuzzy matching algorithm, and it worked like a charm. Whereas like the last time I did it, we had to go and manually classify like 1,000 names to then get an accuracy level and everything. And now it just basically worked out of the box, meaning like the field, as I said, the field's very clean.
Ben, you covered this slightly kind of in the beginning of your presentation, but just to touch again, there's a couple questions I'll combine here regarding kind of the coverage of the people or the resume data. If you can maybe touch on that one more time. I see a question about the coverage of the resume data, and then another question on kind of the fill rate of that contact data, and then going into something like, does the data cover asset management companies, and or just is it a subset of users in the company versus kind of all? How do you think about just general coverage of the people data?
Definitely. I'll kick this off by just saying that everything I'm going to say here is public on our website. So you can actually go to our documentation and we publish fill rate stats. So people will often pre-qualify if we're a good fit or not, just looking at that data. A couple of the things that we have there are, the fill rates for contact information, which checks off one question. Distribution by country, which I think is something that people are often focused on in terms of just like a cursory analysis of what the data set might look like. And then also, information about, how many records we have, how many records we have with each field, et cetera. In terms of our coverage of the global workforce, we are strongest in places that have a strong online presence. If you think about how we're sourcing our data, both from the public web and the data union, a lot of the companies in the data union are software businesses. So they are, of course, also exposed to, is something online? Is it frequently present online, etc.? The areas where we're strongest are typically the white collar, English speaking less. So, engineers, financial, members of the financial workforce, members of, other white collar jobs like consulting, sales, etc. That's areas where we typically have very, very strong coverage. Areas where we have weaker coverage are, manufacturing, people in EMEA or Asia, Pacific. Those are areas where we tend to have a little bit more of a gap in coverage. And people will typically use like a sampling of the data plus the overall workforce or population from like a census bureau to just still use the data and just make adjustments based on, some of the biases that I just described. In terms of our coverage of investment managers, like typically we have very good coverage because those people have a high online presence, are in the white collar workforce. Most of them are in the Western world. Where there are gaps in investment coverage is typically like hedge funds, private equity, firms that are very small and tend to be very private. A lot of those people tend to keep a very low profile on the internet, and those are areas where we've seen gaps. So one of our customers is the largest algorithmic hedge fund, and they use our data for trading signals, but they're unable to use our data for recruiting because the people that they'd be interested in are extremely difficult to find and often not present in our data. So just to give you like a little bit of a picture, it becomes very nuanced as well as you go into these specific categories. And the thing I always encourage our customers and our partners to do is just to really look at the data with a critical eye, ask questions, and we could probably get to a solution as to where the coverage is strong or where the coverage is weak for like the specific use case. And that's something that's really awesome about working with Dewey as well, as I know Evan takes a really consultative approach when working with his partners. And that's one of the reasons that we partnered with them.
Awesome. Last two questions here. I'm going to combine two actually. So can you speak to the job to job flows and why you feel this is potentially limited? And then do you have a sense of the match rate between names and PDL and legal names? How do you handle the nicknames, middle names, etc.? And thinking about the matching problem when working with people data.
David, do you want to take the first and I can take the second?
Yeah, I think I might have said that. I just meant the aggregate company data that's included in the subscription. That's a little more limited because it's the top employee flows. But it seemed to me like the job flows in the individual employee level data, so the people data is not limited at all, because you have the entire resume basically of people, right? So you can see where they go and where they come from.
Definitely. And not to rag on our own data, but I love to do that. I think one limitation that you just brought up, David, is the number of them that are available in the company data set. The other limitation that I would say exists is all of the aggregations of job to job flows in the company data set are a lifetime. So sometimes people are interested in like a specific time period or time horizon for movement. So for example, with the RTO example that you were giving, you might say, okay, like more people left Apple. Did they leave to go to remote companies, or did they just generally leave and end up at any type of company? They were just upset that Apple changed their working policy. That's a research question that would probably not be answerable with the company insights data. You'd probably want to deep dive into that using the person data.
Awesome. And then one last question, just kind of about the schema. And obviously this can be, you can check this on your docs, the PDL docs, or just by downloading a sample on the Dewey platform. But anything on salary or income information for employees, or how are you thinking about that in the future, maybe?
Yeah, so we have an inferred salary field tied to each individual resume today. I love ragging on our own data. I would say that this is a field that currently is really useful for sales and marketing use cases where you're just trying to get, or HR recruiting use cases where you're trying to directionally understand how much somebody is making. We built it using public census and visa information. So the inference is really, really tied to the aggregate and not necessarily the specific person. We don't have information currently on the salary of a specific person. And one of the weaknesses of the approach that we took is it's also not tied to the company. So areas where companies pay way below or way above sort of the average pay band for a title, we've gotten feedback that the data is not really up to snuff, so to speak. We are approaching this in the future as something that we'd like to improve on our roadmap. And the feedback that we've gotten from users is that the best way to get access to this data is through job postings, in terms of publicly available information, there's a couple of job posting providers that I'll typically point people to, while this is not something that we have available. The number one being LinkUp, who they're a job posting provider that aggregates from company job sites. We hope to build that LinkUp data and other data sets into our data to improve our salary model so that it becomes more usable for research use cases. So I guess the answer is yes, we have it, but would I encourage you to use it? Not probably in its current form.
Perfect. Appreciate the transparency. And then, yeah, go ahead. Do you have a question, David?
On Dewey, there's also Wagescape data, I think, which I've thought about linking those, so it could be helpful.
That's correct. Yeah, we do have a job posting inferred salary data set called Wagescape on the platform. Definitely encourage you to check that out. It's included in the subscription today. But I'm also familiar with LinkUp, really, really good data product. So would love to see if you guys continue to think about that partnership with them too. Cool. I guess one more question did come through. I'll answer the subscription question myself kind of as we wind up. But any offering data cleaning instructions for the company insights data, example code books, with variables, software to use, etc. I'll chime in quickly to say this is something that actually Dewey wants to help out with too. And Ben, you might have some insights or some resources here that you're already thinking about as a company, but definitely a data set we want to try to encourage and enable in our platform as well. So it's something that it's actually on our roadmap as well to kind of make it easier to work with. But any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, there's some stuff that we will transparently provide in our documentation, or we'll happily talk about in terms of how we generate the insights fields. So how are we doing a calculation mathematically? What are some assumptions that we're making to make those calculations work out? All of that is publicly available in our documentation. And I'm excited to hear that Dewey is thinking about migrating that into code, because I do think that would be really, really useful. Some stuff is sort of more tied to like our intellectual property. So the things that I would say we view more as IP are obviously our title tagging logic. Some of the work that we're doing to improve understanding the time series movement of employees when they don't actually disclose, when they left or joined a job. So if someone has blank start and end dates, how can we infer or build start and end dates that are rigorous, but also sort of private to how to how we're going to end up generating sort of more and more detailed signals. But most of the like high level stuff that you would probably want to do to like rebuild the transformations, for example, if you wanted to reaggregate like the employee count over time, but just do it for the US. Those are things that they're publicly available in our docs, and I'm excited to hear that Evan and his team are planning to move those to code, because that seems very useful.
Yeah, we are. And then I also would just put a plug for the community, right? Like some of the best content we have in the community is community generated. And so if we do have researchers who are starting to familiarize themselves with this data and have written their own code, like I would love if that's shared back to the community just to help others out and kind of keep it a place where we can collaborate and just have everyone, move more efficiently, kind of with the hope of accelerating research, which is ultimately Dewey's goal. Nice. The last question, I mean, just to be kind of clear about the pricing of the data in terms of where it's included. I probably should have said this from the onset, but today it was mentioned a few times, the company insights data is included with a standard Dewey subscription. So a lot of folks I've seen on this call already have access to that via their subscription. And then the people data would require kind of a unique a la carte, as I call it, license for that data. And the best way to just get more information on that, it depends slightly on, the size of the team, if it's departmental or individual research teams and whatnot. So the best way to get more information on that would just be to reach out to me, and you can reply to the follow-up email you'll get from this in a day or two, if you want to learn more about that. So I think that covers all of our questions. So anyway, thank you both for joining today. I think that was a really great presentation, and I mean, I learned a lot more. I actually didn't know a lot of the stuff we talked about, so it's helpful for me, and I'm excited to see the engagement with the community. Definitely, I can see the excitement here for folks to get their hands on the data. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up, and thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you all for joining.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.